She walked into the dimly lit corner of the Italian restaurant with her head tucked low, her fingers nervously clutching the strap of a faded canvas bag, as if it were a shield protecting her from the judgment of every single person in the room. The setup had been arranged by my well-meaning but hopelessly shallow college friends who thought they were doing me a massive favor by fixing me up on a blind date, whispering ahead of time with cruel amusement that they had found someone who completely matched my supposed lack of league. I sat at the white tablecloth booth, watching her hesitant approach, noting the way she deliberately avoided making eye contact with the surrounding tables where sleek couples laughed over glasses of expensive wine. She carried herself with a heavy, exhausted posture of someone who had walked into 100 rooms like this before and already knew the exact second the other person's smile would turn polite, cold, and distant. When she finally reached my table, she pulled out the chair across from me with a quiet scrape, whispering a tentative apology for being 3 minutes late due to crosstown traffic that had locked up the main avenues. I watched her settle into her seat, her oversized dark sweater swallowing her frame, her breathing shallow as she folded her hands tightly in her lap to hide their tremor. My friends had snickered behind my back earlier that afternoon, dropping heavy hints about her physical appearance with mocking grins, expecting me to look disgusted, make a hasty excuse about an emergency, and walk out within the first 5 minutes, instead of shrinking back or joining in on their cruel game. Something deep inside my chest tightened with a sudden, protective fury at the sheer cruelty of the world that made someone look so terrified just to sit across from a stranger for a bowl of pasta. I did not pull away, nor did I check my watch with an exaggerated sigh. Instead, I reached across the wooden barrier of the table, gently placed my hand over her clenched fingers, and broke the heavy silence with a warm, unfiltered smile that immediately made her look up in pure, stunned disbelief. The initial silence between us stretched out like a fragile glass bridge, threatening to shatter under the weight of her lingering anxiety and the obnoxious chatter of the surrounding diners who were too busy with their own superficial lives to notice the human being sitting right in front of them. She stared down at my hand resting over hers for a long, agonizing moment, as if she were trying to calculate the hidden trick or the sarcastic punchline that was bound to follow any second now. I didn't pull my hand away. I simply left it there, letting the steady warmth of my skin communicate what my tongue hadn't yet managed to articulate in words. Slowly, color crept up her neck and dusted her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from profound, bewildered shock that someone across a blind date table was actually looking at her with genuine kindness rather than hidden mockery. "You don't have to look so terrified," I said softly, keeping my voice low and steady so it wouldn't draw the attention of the snickering table of friends sitting 3 booths down. "I promise you, I'm much more boring than whatever horror story my friends probably warned you about." A sudden, breathless laugh slipped past her lips, sounding like a dam breaking after months of holding back a flood of lonely nights and hurtful rejections. She pulled her hands back gently to adjust her sweater, her shoulders finally dropping an inch or two as the suffocating tension in her posture began to dissipate. "Your friends didn't exactly paint a picture of saints," she murmured, her voice carrying a dry, self-deprecating wit that caught me completely off guard. "In fact, I'm pretty sure the guy who texted me your name implied you were doing me a massive charity by showing up tonight." The blunt honesty of her statement hit me like a physical blow, reminding me of the smug text messages my buddies had sent me earlier boasting about their little social experiment. My jaw tightened, a flash of pure anger burning behind my eyes, not at her, but at the miserable cowards who thought they could play God with people's self-esteem. "Then let's make a deal," I replied, leaning forward across the table and locking my gaze firmly onto hers, refusing to let her look away. "For the next 2 hours, we pretend my friends don't exist, we order whatever the unhealthiest thing on this menu is, and we see if we can actually have a real conversation instead of surviving an audition." She stared at me for 3 full seconds, her eyes searching my face for any trace of irony, mockery, or fake pity, and when she found none, something shifted entirely in the room. The defensive armor she had worn like a second skin since walking through those restaurant doors melted away, revealing a sharp, brilliant intelligence and a pair of eyes that were so striking they made everything else in the room completely fade into the background. Our waiter arrived just a moment later, breaking the spell with an overly cheerful voice and sliding 2 leather-bound menus onto the table before rushing off to tend to a louder party across the room. We opened the pages, But neither of us looked at the gourmet salads or the overpriced appetizers that screamed dietary compliance. Instead, we immediately gravitated toward the heavy, decadent comfort foods buried at the bottom. "If we are going to rebel against my friend's matchmaking agenda," she whispered with a wicked, playful glint in her eye, "we are legally required to order the quadruple cheese lasagna and a basket of garlic bread loaded with enough butter to kill a horse." "Done," I answered immediately, flagging down the passing waiter before she could change her mind. "And bring us a bottle of your heaviest red wine, the kind that doesn't pretend to be sophisticated." The waiter blinked in mild surprise, glancing briefly between us before jotting down the order and hurrying away into the kitchen. As soon as he left, she leaned back against a red leather booth, a genuine, unforced smile stretching across her face for the first time all evening, completely transforming her expression. We started talking about things that had nothing to do with blind dates, body types, or mutual acquaintances. We talked about obscure books we both loved, terrible jobs we had survived in our early 20s, and the absurdity of modern social expectations. She had a razor-sharp sense of humor, dropping deadpan sarcastic remarks that kept catching me off guard and making me laugh out loud in a way I hadn't laughed in years. I learned that she was a freelance graphic designer who spent her nights working on passion projects involving retro video game art, and that she possessed a quiet, fierce resilience that put my entire corporate career into perspective. Every time she spoke, the ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking silverware, the murmurs of wealthy patrons, the distant laughter of my frat boy friends, seemed to recede further and further into background until it was just her voice filling the space. I found myself studying the way her hands moved when she animatedly described a terrible client she had fired last week, the way a small crease formed between her eyebrows when she made a serious point, and the absolute beauty of a person who wasn't trying to perform for anyone else's approval. We were halfway through our second glass of wine when the heavy oak doors of the restaurant swung open and my friends, Mark and Dave, walked in, flanked by their girlfriends, looking smug and triumphant as they scanned the room to check on the wreckage of their little prank. They spotted our table immediately, their eyes locking onto us with expressions of triumphant amusement, expecting to find an awkward, silent disaster where I was desperately trying to escape my chair. Instead, they found us leaning across the table toward each other, mid-laughter, sharing a plate of garlic bread while the empty wine bottle sat between us like a trophy of an evening well spent. Mark nudged Dave in the ribs, a shit-eating grin plastered across his face as they began marching over to our booth under the guise of being good friends checking in. "Hey, man," Mark boomed loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear, slapping his hand onto the back of my booth. "Just wanted to see how the date was going. Everything, meeting your expectations so far." Dave was grinning down at my companion with a patronizing, sickeningly sweet expression that made my blood run boiling hot. "Yeah, hope you guys are finding plenty of common ground," Dave chimed in, his eyes darting pointedly down toward her plate before snapping back to mine with an unspoken, cruel question. "How are you surviving this?" The air at our table instantly shifted, the warm, intimate bubble we had spent the last hour building threatening to pop under the intrusion of small-minded malice. I saw her shoulders tense up again, her gaze drop into her lap as the familiar, crushing weight of public humiliation threatened to drag her back under. My friend stood there waiting for my cue, waiting for me to make a self-deprecating joke, roll my eyes, or make an excuse to ditch her so they could have a good laugh at the bar afterward. I didn't laugh. I didn't roll my eyes. I slowly set my fork down on the table, wiped my mouth with my napkin with agonizing deliberation, and stood up from the booth. I was a head taller than both of them, and the dead, unblinking glare I locked onto Mark's face made his smug grin instantly wither away into nervous confusion. "Actually, Mark," I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, icy tone that carried clearly across the sudden hush of the surrounding tables. "You're right. This date completely exceeded my expectations." Mark swallowed hard, shifting his weight from foot to foot as Dave looked around the room, suddenly realizing they had miscalculated catastrophically. "It exceeded my expectations," I continued, stepping out of the booth and standing shoulder to shoulder with them while looking down my nose at their pathetic, judgmental faces, because I had no idea a single room could hold so much pathetic, insecure garbage until the two of you walked through that door. The silence that fell over our corner of the restaurant was absolute and crushing, save for the faint hum of the overhead air conditioning and the horrified gasp of Dave's girlfriend, who had just realized what kind of absolute losers she was hanging out with. Mark's face flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water as he tried to stammer out a defense. "W, what is your problem, man?" Mark muttered, his voice cracking under the weight of the collective stares from every nearby diner who had turned to watch the public execution. "We were just asking how it was going." "No, you are waiting for a car crash because your own lives are so hollow that you need someone else's misery to feel good about yourselves," I replied coldly, stepping back toward the table and deliberately turning my back on him, as if there were nothing more than a foul smell drifting in from the street. "Now, do us all a massive favor. Turn around, walk out that door, and lose my number before I forget I'm trying to have a nice evening." Dave grabbed Mark by the jacket sleeve, muttering something frantic under his breath, and the two of them practically sprinted out of the restaurant without looking back once, their girlfriends trailing behind them in mortified silence. I slid back into the booth across from her, my heart still hammering against my ribs from the adrenaline rush of putting those miserable cowards in their place. When I looked across the table, she was staring at me with wide, swimming eyes, a single tear cutting a clean path down her cheek, while a trembling, disbelieving smile broke across her lips. You didn't have to do that," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she reached out across the table and took my hand in hers, her grip fierce and unbreakable. "You just completely torched your social life for someone you met 2 hours ago." My social life just got upgraded. I smiled softly, turning my hand over to interlock my fingers with hers, feeling the absolute perfection of a moment where nothing else in the world mattered. "Now, are we going to finish this lasagna, or are we going to let it get cold while we realize that the best night of our lives just started?" She laughed through her tears, squeezing my hand back with a strength that told me she wasn't going anywhere anytime soon, and as the waiter hurried over with a fresh bottle of wine to apologize for the disturbance, I knew with absolute certainty that walking into this restaurant tonight was the best thing that had ever happened to me. She poured us another generous round of the deep red wine, her movement steady and graceful now that the suffocating shadow of my former friends had completely vanished from the restaurant. The ambient hum of the surrounding diners slowly returned to a comforting murmur, washing away the awkward tension and replacing it with an easy, electric intimacy that felt as though we had known each other for years instead of a mere 2 hours. We dug back into the massive, steaming plate of quadruple cheese lasagna, laughing freely as we debated the absolute greatest childhood cartoons and shared ridiculous stories about our worst corporate fashion disasters. Every time our hands brushed across the table while passing the breadbasket, a warm, thrilling current shot straight up my arm, reminding me of the fierce loyalty and sudden, unexpected attraction that had taken root in my chest the moment she sat down. She had an infectious, melodic laugh that seemed to draw the light right into the dimly lit corner of the booth, making the rest of the world and its superficial judgments feel entirely insignificant. I found myself completely captivated by the brilliant spark in her eyes when she talked about her digital art projects, speaking with a passionate fire that commanded the entire space and made me realize how utterly blind anyone would have to be to overlook someone so vibrant. "You know," she said softly, tilting her head slightly as she twirled a final bite of pasta on her fork, her gaze locking onto mine with a steady, searching intensity. "Most guys would have either made an excuse to leave by the salad course or sat there looking miserable just to prove a point to their buddies. Most guys are idiots who don't know what a treasure looks like when it's sitting right in front of them," I replied without a single second of hesitation, keeping my voice low, firm, and entirely sincere. A delicate, rosy blush swept across her cheeks, deepening the natural warmth of her complexion and making her look breathtakingly radiant under the amber glow of the overhead pendant light. She reached across the wooden surface, her fingers sliding over to intertwine with mine once more, tracing the lines of my palm with a gentle, appreciative touch that sent a shiver straight down my spine. The waiter materialized discreetly beside our booth a few moments later, placing a folded leather booklet containing the bill quietly on the edge of the table before offering a polite, respectful nod. I reached for her immediately, but she shot out her hand with surprising speed, tapping the top of the leather folder with a playful, determined grin. "Oh, absolutely not," she insisted, her eyes flashing with a competitive spark. "You already fought off a pack of toxic frat boys and ruined your entire social circle tonight. The least I can do is pay for the carbs." Deal. I chuckled, sliding the bill over to her side of the table while raising my wine glass in a mock toast. Next round of dessert and late-night coffee is officially on me, though. She signed the receipt with a flourish, her smile wider and brighter than it had been all evening, completely free of the defensive armor she had worn when she first pushed open those heavy glass doors. As we finally slid out of the booth and stood side by side, the physical height difference between us melted away into a natural, seamless alignment as our shoulders brushed naturally while walking toward the exit. The cool night air hit us the second we stepped out onto the sidewalk, carrying the crisp scent of approaching autumn and the distant hum of city traffic rushing past under a canopy of clearing stars. Instead of calling for a rideshare immediately, we lingered by the curb. Neither of us wanted the night to end just yet, caught in that magical threshold where a single evening promises to rewrite the entire trajectory of the future. She wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill, and without a second thought, I shrugged off my jacket and draped it carefully over her shoulders, watching as she pulled the fabric tightly around her with a grateful, melting smile. "So," I asked, stepping just a fraction closer to close the remaining gap between us on the sidewalk, "do you think you could survive another date with me tomorrow, or did tonight completely exhaust your quota for dramatic plot twists?" She looked up at me, her eyes shining with absolute certainty and a quiet, beautiful anticipation that made my heart hammer wildly against my ribs. "After the way you handled tonight," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the rush of the passing cars, "I think I'm just getting started." The cool autumn breeze swept down the city street, rustling the fallen leaves around our feet as we finally stepped away from the curb and began walking slowly toward a nearby subway station. The frantic energy of the restaurant was completely gone, replaced by the quiet, rhythmic tapping of our shoes against the concrete and the comforting warmth of my jacket resting securely around her shoulders. She walked just close enough that our arms brushed with every other step, a silent, natural rhythm that felt as familiar and effortless as if we had been walking this exact path together for years. I could still feel the lingering adrenaline from the showdown with Mark and Dave, but looking down at her profile as streetlights cast a soft, golden glow across her face, that anger felt light years away and completely irrelevant. What mattered was the way she laughed at a passing car hitting a puddle, the way her hand occasionally reached over to lightly graze my knuckles, and the undeniable truth that my life had just irrevocably changed for the better. "You know," she said, breaking the quiet rhythm of our footsteps as we paused near the glowing entrance of the subway stairs, her eyes reflecting the neon signs of the avenue behind us, "when my friends told me I was being set up on a blind date tonight, I almost canceled 3 different times because I was so tired of being the punchline." "I'm just endlessly grateful you didn't," I replied, stepping closer, so there was barely an inch of space left between us in the cool night air. "Because if you had stayed home, I would have spent the rest of my life wandering around restaurants completely unaware of what I was missing." She offered a soft, breathless smile, her gaze dropping to the pavement for a brief second before she looked back up with a fierce, quiet confidence that took my breath away. "Well, you're stuck with me now," she teased gently, the playful challenge in her voice sending a warm, electric thrill straight down my spine. No refunds, no exchanges, and definitely no return to the oversized jacket. "I wouldn't dream of it," I smiled, reaching out to gently tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, my fingers lingering for a moment against the soft skin of her cheek before she leaned instinctively into my touch. The rumble of an approaching train echoed faintly from deep beneath the concrete stairs, signaling that our evening was drawing to its inevitable close, but neither of us made a move toward the entrance. Instead, we stood there under the flickering amber street lamp, caught in that perfect, suspended moment where saying goodbye felt entirely impossible. She slipped her hand out from under the jacket sleeve, her fingers sliding into mine and squeezing tightly as if to anchor us both to the pavement. "Are you free tomorrow evening?" I asked quietly, the question slipping out before I could even overthink it, driven by an urgent need to make sure this wasn't just a one-night anomaly. I know a little late-night diner 3 blocks from here that makes the absolute worst coffee in the city, but the booth seats are deep and nobody ever bothers you. "It's a date," she answered without a moment's hesitation, her smile radiating pure, unadulterated happiness that outshone every neon sign on the avenue. As she finally turned toward the subway stairs, her hand slipping slowly from mine with a reluctant parting touch. She looked back over her shoulder one last time before descending into the station. I stood at the top of the steps watching her go until she disappeared around a platform corner, my heart feeling lighter than it had in years, knowing that tomorrow wasn't just another day, but the official continuation of a story that had just begun. The morning sun cut sharp, brilliant diagonals through the sheer curtains of my apartment, splashing warm golden light across the hardwood floor, and waking me up with sudden, restless energy I hadn't felt in years. I rolled over and stared at the empty space on my nightstand where my phone rested, its screen dark, yet my mind was already racing back to the exact moment we parted ways at the subway entrance just hours ago. The routine weekend silence of my building felt entirely different today. It wasn't the heavy, stagnant quiet of a lonely bachelor pad anymore, but rather a quiet pregnant with anticipation, humming with the invisible thread of a promise made under a flickering street lamp. I got out of bed, threw on a worn gray hoodie, and padded into the kitchen to brew a pot of coffee, watching the black liquid drip into glass carafe, while replaying every single word, smirk, and sarcastic remark from last night's dinner in my head. My phone finally buzzed against the counter with a sharp vibration, making me jump slightly as a text notification lit up the display with her name, reading simply, "If that diner coffee is as bad as you promised, you're legally obligated to buy me pancakes to compensate." A loud, involuntary laugh broke out of my chest, and I typed back a rapid response challenging her to a maple syrup showdown at 7 sharp. Knowing right then that the hours stretching between now and evening were going to crawl by like a glacier, I spent the afternoon cleaning up the apartment with manic focus, tossing out old mail, straightening the stack of books on the coffee table, and pacing back and forth across the living room like a nervous teenager going on his very first date. By the time the clock on the microwave ticked past 6:30, the sun had begun to dip below the skyline, casting long, bruised violet shadows across the asphalt outside as the evening chill started to creep back into the air. I threw on a dark jacket, checked my reflection in the hallway mirror one last time to make sure I didn't look completely deranged, and headed out the door into the brisk autumn evening, my heart hammering a frantic, eager rhythm against my ribs a whole 3-block walk to the diner. The neon sign of the corner diner buzzed with a low, erratic hum against the deepening violet sky, casting a nostalgic pink and amber glow over the worn linoleum steps as I pushed open the heavy glass door. The familiar scent of old coffee grounds, melting butter, and toasted sourdough immediately wrapped around me like an old, comforting blanket, instantly transporting me back to late-night study sessions and endless cups of lukewarm brew from my college days. I scanned the cozy interior, passing a few solitary regulars hunched over newspapers in the counter stools, before my eyes locked onto our favorite corner booth tucked safely beneath a frosted glass window. There she sat, wearing an oversized knit emerald sweater that made her eyes sparkle under the dim overhead lamp, her hands wrapped tightly around a thick ceramic mug, as if she were absorbing its residual heat. The second I slid into vinyl booth across from her, the empty space between us vanished, and the slight tension of anticipation melted away, replaced by the warm, effortless rhythm we had forged the night before. "You're exactly 2 minutes late," she murmured playfully, a brilliant, teasing smile spreading across her lips as she lowered her mug down onto the Formica table. I was just starting to calculate how many pancakes I'd have to eat alone before I called off the search party. Traffic on the psychic highway was completely jammed. I replied smoothly, leaning forward across the table and resting my elbows on the surface. Besides, I had to make sure I brought my absolute A game for the Maple Syrup Championship. Her laughter bubbled up, light and musical, cutting straight to the low hum of the diner's old jukebox playing a distant classic rock tune in the corner. The elderly waitress shuffled over with a stain pad and a stained coffee pot, pouring a generous, steaming stream into my mug without needing to ask what I wanted before shuffling off toward the kitchen without a word. We picked up right where we left off the previous evening, diving headfirst into a whirlwind conversation that skipped effortlessly from absurd childhood memories to the deeper, quieter truths we usually kept hidden from the rest of the world. I learned about her fierce passion for indie game design, the late nights she spent sketching strange, beautiful creatures on her tablet, and the quiet resilience that kept her moving forward even when the world tried to box her into narrow, cruel definitions. Every gesture she made, The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the animated sweep of her hands when she made a particularly sarcastic point, felt etched into my consciousness, as if my mind had been quietly waiting for months to memorize every single detail. "You know," she said softly after the waitress dropped off a towering plate of butter-soaked pancakes covered in a mountain of golden syrup, her gaze locking onto mine with sudden, disarming sincerity, "nobody has ever looked at me the way you did last night at that restaurant. Not just defending me, but actually seeing me. That's because everyone else in the city is too blind to realize what's right in front of them." I answered, my voice dropping an octave, losing all its playful edge and carrying a heavy, undeniable truth that made her breath hitch. She reached across the table, her fingers sliding over the cold surface to intertwine with mine, her grip strong and warm, anchoring us completely in our own little universe while the rest of the diner faded into a blur. We didn't need grand gestures or crowded rooms anymore. We had this quiet corner booth, a stack of sticky pancakes, and the breathtaking realization that a setup meant to mock us had instead handed us the missing piece of our lives. As we shared a fork and laughed over who poured too much syrup, I knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that whatever chapters came next in our story, I was never going to let her walk alone again.